Welcome to the Elevate Your Equity podcast, where we, as married busy professionals, leverage real estate investing to unlock the 3+1 degrees of freedom: health, location, time, and financial.
Today, I am joined by Mr. Denis Shapiro. Denis, how are you, man?
I'm doing good, Derek. I am super excited to be here.
Awesome, man. Great to have you on the show. And for those who don't know Denis, first of all, Denis and I have been in a pod for quite some time together. It's been going on 2 years, hasn't it? Or maybe more than that now?
2.5. Yeah, I think COVID.
2.5.
I think it started during COVID.
2.5 years. And so we've been meeting almost every single week in that pod. And it's been one of the most valuable pods that I've ever had. We can talk about that a little bit later on, but I want to introduce you, audience, to Denis. He actually began investing in real estate back in 2012 when the market was just beginning to recover from the global financial crisis. And he built a cash flowing portfolio, including many alternative assets such as Note, ATM funds, mobile home parks, life insurance policies, tech startups, industrial property, short-term rentals, and more. That is already making me very tired, sir. Soon afterwards, he launched SIH Capital Group, a company that provides accredited investors with a simplified strategy to invest for passive income. And then Denis has also observed key changes in alternative asset markets in the decade of recovery from the global financial crisis, triggered by a bunch of legislation that we can talk about in a little bit. And Denis wrote the Alternative Investment Almanac, Expert Insights on Building Personal Wealth in Non-Traditional Ways back in 2021. His book is based on his own experience in becoming a successful alternative asset investor and contains interviews with some of the best alternative asset investors in business today. Denis, I am super excited to jump into the show today. Are you?
I am truly honored. I've been thinking about this all week and ready to rock and roll.
Awesome. Well, let's do it, man. Let's start how we normally start with all of our guests, which is, why don't you tell us a little bit about how real estate in general got the spark going for you? What was it about real estate investing that truly got you excited and started exploring the space more?
Yeah, I'll try to keep this as short as possible because this is generally a pretty long answer. So I started investing when I was actually 14 years old. My brother gave me a copy of Rich Dad Poor Dad. Absolutely hated the book. I was a super cynic at that time. But I was like, all right, let me actually start investing. I had, I think, $1,000 saved up from my part-time jobs. Went and did the worst thing I can imagine. I went to my older brother and I said, what do you do to invest? And he was like, oh, I buy mutual funds. I was like, oh, this is a great idea. Let me do what you do. Spent about a year looking at this one mutual fund that my brother highly recommended in quotation marks. I think it went up $7 during that whole time period. And I actually had to pay for a trade during that time period. That's how old I am. and I was like, oh, this is not what I had in mind. I'm not going to get really rich at $7 a year type of growth. Switched, went the whole individual stock picking, went the whole Warren Buffett, did my research, went to business school, was like, hey, this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to be like a stockbroker, something related to stock. And I went in right in 2005. By the time my senior year, it was smack in the middle of the global financial crisis. Basically, I had two choices, basically either pivot or go back to school. So I was like, all right, I guess the smart move is just to go for my MBA at this point with no real work experience. So I went for my MBA, got my, when I was in my MBA, I was recruited by the government, got my first paycheck from the government, a real paycheck, not my part-time jobs prior. And I was like, oh, it's great. The government's not only my employer, they're also my business partner because of the amount of taxes they were taking out. And this kind of leads up to the question that you originally asked is, I went home that day and I was like, how do I pay less taxes? And the first couple of results were semi-illegal. So I went back and I was like, how do I pay less taxes legally? And then the whole first page was real estate. And that got me. Then I made the second biggest mistake. I went to my oldest brother at that time, and this is a consistent theme in my life. I said, hey, do you have any real estate that you want to sell? And he looked at his whole portfolio, gave me one of his worst properties. I cut my teeth on that property, but then went way more passive after that. And yeah, that was my spark. It was about 10 years of being on the traditional side and then figuring out, hey, I hesitate to use the word better, but there's a complementary set of assets that's in this alternative space that we kind of dabble in.
Right, right. And so what helped you maintain that space? Because I think you kind of went really over it real quick, but I want to know from you how you were able to maintain that first rough property that you got, because it's very easy for you to just throw up your hands and say this at least for real estate investing isn't for me, but then you stuck with it and then you found the passive side. So what kept you going through all of this?
That's a great point. It was mainly because I was seeing that other people were doing it better than I was. So it was either me coming in with a victim's mentality, and I'm like, one of my pet peeves in life is the victim mentality, and say like, oh, my brother sold me a bad property, or, the path of progress is not coming to my area, but it's going, 20 blocks away. It's all these things that you could say, or you could just say like, hey, I made a really, really bad decision. I did no market research. I asked someone who was invested themselves on what they want to sell. So I committed all the bucket list items of things you should not do when it comes to buying an investment. So I took that on myself. And I ended up looking back at it. I'm like, okay, I got to GC that project. I did a complete renovation. I went through evictions. They weren't as scary as I thought it was. I had the police called out. I had to go walk the property with a police officer. So I did all of that, and it was like, okay, it wasn't as scary. But at the same time, I got to a point really, probably I would say 2-3 years in with that property, where I very firmly came to the decision where I don't want to scale this. I didn't want 30 of those. So that actually got me into the rabbit hole of more passive stuff, because I wanted some of the benefits that real estate can give to you, but I didn't want to be the one responding to the burglar alarms. I didn't want to be the one that was dealing with the evictions. And that kind of actually got me down this rabbit hole that ended up being commercial real estate, where you got the professional property management, you got all of those things that buffered that part of the things that I hated when I was a landlord for that one property.
Yeah, I love that. So I want the listeners to really take away a main theme throughout this. Dennis, you may not know this, but when you were doing this, you were taking the internal locus of control. You were saying, okay, all those things out there is actually a result of my doing. And I find that the most people that end up looking inward to try to find a solution to their problems, whether it's finding a good investment to go with, or they have a problem with a property that they just are stuck with, right? The people that succeed and stick with it and end up making money in the long run, because that's usually the way that it always does, is the people that have their mind right. They have this victim mentality that's not there, right? Or they've learned to evolve from it. They've learned to take responsibility for their actions. So just want to, point that out for the audience members. If you guys are in a situation right now where it's really tough, listen to Dennis's story, because obviously, this is a story that has a beginning and it's always rough, but it gets much better. So I just wanted to point that out there. I don't know if you have anything you want to add to that, but that's what I've observed in listening.
Yeah, it's ironic. My son, actually, this is kind of related, but also related. My son started school. He was in first grade, and it was a big thing for me to get him on the bus. And I had to fight my in-laws to get him on the bus. And the first day, literally, he got off the bus screaming and crying. And I was doing breakfast for him, and I was like, look, I know the bus wasn't a good situation last year, but you could either shut down from the situation, or you could actually label what made it uncomfortable, what made it bad. And then, he got to the root of it. No one wanted to sit next to him. So I said, look, that's normal for a first day, but let's, what happens if that happens again? Then, what can we do? And the solution was so simple. I was like, why don't you just bring a book? If no one wants to sit with you, pull out the book and just read your book. And of course, he gets off the bus today, and he was happy. He made a friend. He read a little bit of his book. He had a great day at the bus. He was complimented, but basically, I think it's instilled to us at such an early age, especially when people that mean well, they really do. His grandparents love him, almost too much to a certain extent. But what they're teaching him to do when they kind of cuddle him and basically tell them, it's okay, maybe you won't do the bus the next day, is they're teaching him that victim mentality, basically saying, the bus is not for you. And it's crazy when you really think about it. It's ingrained at such a young age. And it's like we have to be like the voice of like, hey, you know what? Just label what the problem is, because that's what we deal with every single day in commercial real estate, right? We got that one tenant and we could blame the eviction laws, and we could blame, there's always somebody or something to blame, especially with geopolitical health, whatever you want to do, there is, or political, whatever you want to do, there is always someone to blame. But the ability to actually just start with I is just so powerful that I can't
Yep.
I can't say that enough.
Totally agree, man. And I think before we move on, like, I think that's a great example, very visceral for people to listen and hear about, little kids, because it's very easy to relate with that because we all were that once. But the best leaders out there are the ones that when things go wrong, they take accountability for it. And when things go well, they give credit to other people. That is like the ultimate level in mindset and being able to lead, right? And you're able to help like start to walk your children through that process by using this very cool example early on. So that's awesome stuff. But what I want to do now is I want to kind of shift over to alternative investments, because we got the pro here. So we want to make sure that we take advantage of this time as much as we can. So let's start from the beginning here. Where did your passion for alternative investments come from? I know we talked about real estate. So like, how did you start shifting around and discovering these alternative investments?
So what ended up happening was I discovered a huge problem with the traditional side of my portfolio. And when I talk about traditional, I mean really stocks and bonds. This is the stuff that your financial advisor is going to give you. This is the stuff that when I started 14, I had my Scottrade account, and this is what I was digging into. And what I started realizing was that I had all these strategies where, ideally speaking, I wanted two things from my portfolio. I wanted income and I wanted appreciation. That's all I ever wanted from my portfolio. And what I started realizing was there was always a part of my portfolio that was really appreciating really well. The problem in my portfolio was always the income side. Is I couldn't crack this nut. Like I had a situation where I was buying REITs and I was buying MLPs and I was buying these high dividend stocks in these utility companies. And the same things kept happening over and over again, where I would own them for a year or two. I see them underperforming just the index fund for a year or two. And I'm like, okay, don't worry, because the old adage is when the market starts crashing, those defensive stocks, they're going to be the ones that holding up really well. And then I went through one correction and I'm like, okay, they didn't actually stay afloat. They actually went down just as much as the index fund. And then I went through another market correction. And then the same thing kept happening over and over again, where I realized that the old adages don't work anymore because of the algorithms. And the way that the algorithms play on the market is that basically something goes down, everything goes down type of mentality. And so what I started realizing was all these things that I was supposed to be getting income from, highly underperformed the appreciation stuff. And then when it was time for them to do their job, they couldn't do their job because of the computer algorithm. So I realized that I had a solution and a problem. Solution, I realized that I could simplify my whole traditional portfolio and just put it in an index fund and move on with my life. The problem is I needed somewhere to get that income. And what ended up happening is with my first real estate purchase, and then I did a note fund, and then I forgot what my other passive fund was. I started seeing, I'm like, wow, these private, everything in the alternative space was basically private, right? I couldn't trade in and out. They weren't volatile. So I was seeing like consistent cash flow. And then when the market actually had a correction, the underlying asset didn't change hands. So there was no price fluctuation. So I didn't need the defensiveness. It just naturally kind of had this defensive element. So what I started realizing was it's not like, should I do traditional alternatives? It's like, hey, I could just do 1% of my brain power on a traditional index fund, set it, forget it, let it appreciate. And now I got 99% of my brain power to really do this cool alternative investment portfolio that will give me that stability, that will give me that cash flow, and it solves the income. So what I just realized is that I couldn't get everything I wanted out of the traditional side, but by actually labeling what that's actually good at, I was able to then realize what I needed. And the alternative side kind of started really like like it started really showing what it's good at. And then it all kind of made sense at that point.
Right. That makes sense. That's awesome. So it kind of evolved out of a need, right? It sounds like you have one place where you're able to kind of work on just appreciation, which is the index fund, right? At the very beginning, just put it into the index fund, don't worry about the dividend yielding stocks, and then start to look for solutions outside of that, which is very cool. So as far as alternative assets out there go, I know that this question is much different if I ask it last year or the year before. But what is your favorite alternatives assets out there right now in 2022, and then also going forward into 2023? What do you think is good for most people to start looking at, or at least for your favorite ones, because everyone's situation is different?
Yeah, so everyone's is different. One thing I would like to say is, and it was one of the reasons why I wrote my book, was that alternative assets have a certain language, and once you start learning elements of that language, they start mirroring each other in other assets that you think are not related, but they're actually very, very related. Mm-hmm. So for example, if you learn the basics of mobile home parks, you can look at a self-storage deal, or you can look at a multifamily, because you're going to see the same terms, right? You're going to hear the cap rates, the cash on cash, the IRR, all those terms are going to repeat. So it's hard to say that there's a favorite. I like to focus in on where my operating partners are finding deals at the current moment. That's kind of the way we're doing it. The last year and a half, the focus has been on affordable housing, and I know that's something that's true in time to your heart as well. So right now, at the specific moment, SIH Capital Group, we started with an income fund, and then we kind of evolved into operating our own deals. So we are most heavily invested in the affordable housing space. We love the space. It's one of the only spaces in the commercial real estate world where there's an actual natural barrier of entry because of the compliances, because of the bureaucracies. Most operators, and it's not in any way a negative, I don't want this to come off negative, but most operators out there in the syndication space, 99% of them have a very similar business plan, right? You're going to look at their business model, and it's going to be about improving the kitchens, the bathrooms. They're going to get an extra $200 a month. How many dog parks are you going to see? All of those things, where in affordable housing, it's almost a completely different animal. It's about the wait list. It's about getting the expenses down. It's about being compliant. And most of the time, the occupancy is so strong with the wait list, you really don't have to do these heavy value add plays. You just really need to give them a great product for what their need is. And that's in such a critical, and it's in such demand out there, that we really like the affordable housing space. So I would put commercial real estate as my favorite asset class for the time we're seeing and for the foreseeable future.
I got it. Yeah. I was going to say too, that every asset class has different seasons, right? Because there's like a layer of popularity, hence Bitcoin, right? And Bitcoin mining, things like that. There's also a layer of like inflation that comes in. There's locality. There's international stuff. There's all kinds of things and factors that feed into what it is. So I highly recommend that you guys out there look into all types of different alternative assets. And Denis's book is a great place to start, which we can talk about in just a little bit. But maybe we can pull some nuggets out from the book right now on the podcast for our listeners. How does someone, or maybe you can provide some key pointers for folks that are trying to pick out the best alternative asset classes for them? Like, what should they be looking at? How do they know where to start? Like, what's the menu of options for them, and how should they start thinking about what's important to them and what's not?
So that's a great question. So I would take this as a two-pronged approach. First thing is, you really need to actually kind of itemize the assets that you currently have, figure out where you actually have a need in. So that's really, really, I think, important, and people skip the step because they automatically start looking at deals and they automatically get blinded by like total returns. And the biggest thing, Derek, I know you see this too. The biggest thing that you catch between an experienced investor and someone just starting out in the space is the person who's starting out in the space, they get blinded when they see like a 20% IRR. They're like, this is the greatest deal ever. The experienced investor looks at the total returns as the last thing there is. So I think when you look at that approach, forget about the return. Look at what you actually need. What are your needs? And then that's step step one. Step two, this is the part that I think people forget, is to actually begin teaching yourself and networking. And the reason why I say that is that sometimes your network will lead you to your best possible opportunity. And if you're surrounded by, if you network and you have 5 guys that you consistently talk to in the self-storage space, why are you going out and investing in mobile home parks? At that point, that makes absolutely no sense. So what I like to say is figure out what you need. There's so many alternative assets that will fit those needs, but then don't go and find operators. Then go find your network, and doing that first. And in my book, I actually write the kind of the sequence that I kind of went about, and I'll just rehash it really quick. Like the first thing I recommend you do is just go into LinkedIn and post in on your title, your name. Just put in investor, real estate investor, ATM fund investor, self-storage investor, startup investor. What's going to end up happening is a few days later, you're going to get bombarded by these 15-minute call requests. And these requests are a complete waste of time most of the time, but take them, because when you're starting out, what you want to do is you want to have those conversations and figure out what terms you're not understanding. So if you're talking to a commercial real estate guy, don't look at the deal, just have the conversations and literally write down every word that you did not understand and then look them up after the conversation. And then what that will do is, the reason why that's such a critical step is because the next step is to actually go to conferences, go into multifamily meetups. You do not want to go there without no knowledge of the key terms, because what's going to end up happening is you're going to go to people, you're going to talk to them, and you're going to come off as you asking for help versus you trying to actually network and provide value to someone. Because if you go to a multifamily meetup, you can't be like, well, what's the cap rate to someone? Because then you're going to bombard them with question. So you got to do your homework. And the easiest way to do your homework is actually do on LinkedIn. And once you got that, then you start going to the conferences, then you maybe join a mastermind, and then you will kind of get guided to the asset classes that are right for you, because now you got people that you're connecting with on a consistent basis. And no one will ever tell someone that they're networking with, oh, you should invest with that guy, he just completely wasted my $50,000. So,
Yeah, exactly.
Really, so figure out your needs, get educated, build a network, and then find the asset classes to match that.
I like that. That's a really good thing. Now, just to paint an example for someone, let's say that I'm initially interested in ATM funds, but then I start getting attracted to Bitcoin mining, or now I'm actually into some other just notes, private notes, right? And what if I have an equal interest in all these things? Because there's an adage there where it's like you can go, an inch wide and a mile deep, or you can try to hit as many asset classes as possible. What's your thoughts on that for people that are maybe specializing or looking to try to specialize versus being a generalist? Do you have any thoughts on that at all, or I'm just curious where you're coming from?
That is a great question. So my answer to that is it depends on your personality. Are you a person that is easily attracted to the silver object syndrome, right? So if you're looking at 25 assets at the same time, that's probably a bad thing. So I remember I had a couple of investors that reached out, and I think they were asking about assisted living and a couple of things that I actually genuinely didn't do. I wrote about 9 assets, but I didn't write about all of them. So I remember, and I told them the same thing. What I do is I stick to my core assets, and that's, multifamily, self-storage, notes, hard money lending. Those are my core assets. Now, when a new asset actually comes up on my horizon, what I like to do is I actually like to follow it along for like 2 years. And that's something people are super impatient about. Like I remember I did a infinite banking policy, and I spent 2 years researching it and driving into it, going over the pros and cons and talking myself out of it and talking myself back into it, all of these different things. But I was okay. And I set myself a timer for 2 years, because the reason is after 2 years, it's time to either invest in that asset class or stop looking at it, because you're not going to learn anything else about that policy. But 2 years is also enough time to actually follow along on a deal or two. So I think it's like a catch-22, because people say the best thing to do is be diversified. And then, but if you're super diversified, Warren Buffett is not going out there buying Bitcoin. He sticks to his, he knows his insurance companies, he knows his large cap undervalued stocks, and he's done really well on it, right? So my answer to that is, if you have the personality that gets easily distracted, then be more specialized. If you have the ability to systematize it, then by all means diversify.
Yeah, I really love that, Dennis, because sometimes we have to fight our own nature, because we tend to go to the extremes because we feed ourselves in that, right? And I think that moderation is good, because while it's good to specialize, maybe you specialize in a diverse basket of alternative investments, right? Because I'm just trying to think back to my conversation with Jeremy Roll, right? And Jeremy is an amazing investor. He has a great long-term perspective, and he's very willing to explore these different avenues, right? And as a matter of fact, that's probably where you picked up some of this perspective from, is like, oh, ATM funds, that works now. Bitcoin mining, that works now, right? Multifamily, that used to work, but it doesn't now. And so I just really love this approach of like knowing who you are as a person, and then self-adjusting to figure out what type of asset's going to work. And I also really like to, and I want your thoughts on this before I move on, because this is super important. What do you think about investors who understand a certain amount of criteria? Like once they get the vocabulary down, right? They're like, okay, what I want appreciation, cash flow, and capital protection, or like some allocation of those, right? You can't get all three at the same time. You kind of have to prioritize, right? At least that's what most people start learning out, is you have to figure out, okay, what am I going to give up to get more of? And so what do you think about the approach of saying, okay, if I'm looking for capital preservation first, and then cash flow next, and then appreciation last, trying to find assets or asset classes that fit into that criteria and exploring those? Like, would you think that would be a good approach also? Or do you think that that's maybe a backwards approach of looking at it?
I think people like to throw out things like they're looking for capital preservation as like buzzwords. But then when I talk to most investors, like, I'm like, what do you mean by capital preservation? Obviously, no one wants to lose money, right? And then what people are really looking for most of the time is total return. And that is like, I think it's human nature. I think even if someone who's in their 60s right now that should be in the bucket of capital preservation, they are also looking at the fact that you got inflation at 7, 8, 9% right now. So how could you be truly capital, for them investing in 2-3% returns right now for the sake of capital preservation, still 6-7% loss. So I think we all want to be inherently capital preservation, but capital preservation, I think, comes with your own experience and knowledge. Because if someone is extremely experienced in knowledge and they look at a deal that is perceived as risky by other people, but they understand the variables of that deal, I would say it's a safer deal than someone who doesn't really understand anything and is just blindly, passively investing. So I always put that if you're going to do capital preservation, if you're going to put capital preservation as a high priority, then what you're really saying is that you have a high priority on educating yourself and knowledge. So I kind of remove that from the equation. So then it's about like appreciation and cash flow. And I think it's super important for deals, especially these days, is for the deal to have a somewhat balance of returns coming from the cash flow and the returns coming from the refi and the sale. I recently had a deal of a person I'm kind of coaching, and they sent me this deal. I was like, can you help me break it down? I said, sure. I looked at the deal, and first red flag is they underwrote the refi. It wasn't even like a bonus, like we'll try to get the refi. They underwrote the refi, and you realize why, because there's such a large, they project such a large refi that you basically, your cash on cash is 30% because they're going to give you a refi in year 3 of 100%. Okay, but what happens if that doesn't happen? You only got $1,000 of cash flow in year 2. So, and then you look at year 4, it's the same thing. It's $1,000 cash flow, and then they're expecting a miracle double in year 5. So I had this conversation with him, and I was like, look at the percentage you're getting from the cash flow of the deal versus the percentage you're getting from the sale of the deal, which may or may never happen. So, you have to take that into consideration. And that's why these days, I skew for deals that actually cash flow from day one. The sale is a bonus at this point, but nothing is really guaranteed in today's rate environment, whether or not you're going to be able to sell in 3 years. I think people have gotten conditioned to that, especially investors that started in 2018. It's almost like the worst thing that could happen. Like I came from 2012, but I got much more serious in 2018. So I know how my peers think, and they got conditioned into thinking that they're just going to put this money into these deals. They're going to go full cycle in 3 years, and they're going to make a 1.7, 1.8 in 3 years. And when you present them a deal that's only a 13 to 15% IRR, which I've learned is the only way I really underwrite. And then they turn around, they say, well, the last 5 deals I saw was a 26% IRR. I said, okay, good luck with that. But it's a dangerous situation. So I think in terms of capital preservation, cash flow appreciation, I think it's really, really important to focus on cash flow for the foreseeable future until the interest rates really, really start stabilizing and then start, leveling off a little bit. Right. So to me, cash flow is king right now.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right on that. And like, I mean, again, I have no idea when this podcast is being listened by you, dear listener, because, right now we're recording this in the end of Q3, 2022. And right now there's a lot of uncertainty in the markets. So depending on when you're listening to this, it may not make sense. But if you're investing in this time, then you'll understand what Denis is talking about. Just because it's been crazy. We've seen with COVID and the stimulus a whole bunch of insane amount of cap compression, or sale prices exploding because people think that they can get in and just sell the property, in a couple of years. And I think that we're actually returning to a more normal market, Denis, where the rate of returns at 12%, 15%, that's also accounting, by the way, not accounting for tax advantages, which is a big part of why we do what we do. But that's actually a pretty reasonable return for the amount of risk that you're taking when compared to the 8% that the stock market's supposed to appreciate year over year on average over the last 50 to 75 years. So, looking at an investment, and again, understanding too that a forecast is just a forecast. Denis, I could go in there right now and I could say, yeah, you know what? Instead of selling at $75,000 a door when we exit, I'm going to sell at $80,000 a door. That's what I think in 5 years. And then the deal becomes an incredible deal, and anyone can do that. And so that's what you're trying to convey to your, investors who are maybe just starting out, that you got to look at the operator. Now, let's shift there for our final question. Then we'll head into the final, the rapid round here. What in your mind would you say is the mark of a fantastic alternative asset operator? What is it that people should be looking for at these conferences if someone is interested in self-storage, or they're interested in, what's a common theme, right? Because a lot of multifamily operators, they'll tell you, here's the criteria, this is what I do. But there's got to be a common thread that maybe you've been seeing across all these operators that have done good work.
So this is interesting because I had a section in my book that was a Q&A for every asset class that I picked. And in that Q&A, I got, I think, really well-regarded investors in that space to fill out the exact same questionnaire for their asset class. So I had Jeremy Roll talk about ATMs. I had Brian Burke about apartment buildings. I had some really, really big names, really, really happy. So it was really interesting to see how they each answered the questions, because it was the same set of questions for every single one. And I think I remember the last question was basically like, what do you see yourself in like 5 years? Do you see yourself investing in this asset class in 5 years? And some of these operators are true marketers, and yes, this is the greatest thing since sliced bread. And then some operators gave you a very, very different perspective. And then like one answer I remember was, one operator was, and I think this is kind of would be my final answer if this was Jeopardy, was they said, I said, would you invest in this space in 5 years? And the operator said, honestly, I don't know if I'm going to be invested in next month because I'm just going to look at the data and just go for it. It's not that he's saying he's selling his whole portfolio in a month. In a month. What he's basically saying is that he's consistently looking at the landscape of what's out there, and he is making decisions based on that. So I think it's the sense of open-ended. And you talk to these people who are, are at a different league in our space, and it's the same thing. Even though they've been doing it for years and years and years, they literally treat this as maybe next month we're just not going to buy anything. And it's that ability to actually pivot, I think, is the trademark of a really good operator. And it brings me back to one of our, I remember in our mastermind, one of the quotes that was said, I don't want to quote it as who said it, but I know, and one of Andrew's favorite lines was, a good operator can save a bad deal, a bad operator can kill a great deal.
Yeah, 100%. So good. I love that, man. Thank you very much for that input. That's a really great thing for people to consider. And I know that we're supposed to move over to the rapid round right now, but I can't resist asking you this question because I've been staring at it on the screen, and I wanted to make sure that I ask it. What is, of all of these, alternative investments that you're doing, like all this switching and all of this moving around, what would you say is one of the toughest lessons that you've learned throughout your investing career?
Toughest lesson, besides not listening to your brother on investment advice?
Well, that goes without saying. That's kind of, we mentioned that already.
So I think this is, I wouldn't label it as tough. I would label this as bittersweet, is the going in and expecting success from the first time you do something. Mm-hmm. And I remember, Derek, I think we talked about your first time, when you raised money and you went into a deal.
Oh, yeah.
And you could label that as troubled, but damn, how much did you learn from that experience? So I always tell people, my first mutual fund investment was a terrible decision. My first individual stock was a terrible decision. My first syndication was a terrible decision. And it's like, I have a list of these mistakes, but I will tell you that the second deal I did was slightly better. And then the third was even better. And then the fourth, and now I look back at it, I was like, not in a million years would I remake that first decision. So I'm okay. It's okay to make a really bad decision the first time, as long as you're not consistently remaking the same exact bad decision over and over again. It's fine.
Yeah. You just got to be consistent enough and be able to take an honest look at where you've been and stick with it. It goes back all the way full circle around to the mindset piece, right? That internal locus of control, understanding that you are the maker of your own decisions, right? And if you make the decision, you got to sit in your own gravy, right? That's what you got to do. I don't think that's an expression, but I just went ahead and made that up. So
sit in your own gravy.
There we go. Yeah. Sit in your own gravy, roast in your own gravy. All right.
There you go.
Cool, man. Right now, this has been an awesome conversation, but we still have 5 final questions for you that we're going to rapidly ask you, if you don't mind. So if you're ready to go, let's jump in.
It's okay. I could pause before the second question. Don't worry.
It's all good. All right. Number 1. I don't know if you're a big book reader, but what book has had the biggest impact on you and why? And we ask that it not be Rich Dad, Poor Dad or the Bible, because we get that every time.
I would actually say your book, the Part-Time Real Estate book. The reason, for anybody who doesn't know, is in our pod, literally Derek came in like the first week and was like, oh, by the way, I just published a book. And that, it wasn't the fact that the content or anything like that. It's just to be associated with someone that just wrote a book and now you're talking to them consistently. I think without that book, I probably wouldn't have wrote my book. His book, huge impact. Highly recommend everybody to pick a copy up.
That's awesome. I love that. Thank you so much. All right. Number 2, if people wanted to emulate your success, what do you think is the first actionable thing they could do to follow in your footsteps?
change your LinkedIn to whatever investor that you want to become. It's such an easy step. People will start reaching out to you. And there's also a psychological thing when people actually reach out to you versus you, reaching out to people for help.
Yeah, I think that's a very subtle shift, and very tangible, easy thing to do. I would also say too, like, look at your LinkedIn profile and start moving in the direction where the puck is going, right? Like what direction you think you want to go. As long as you're approximately in the right direction, you'll start heading in the right way, right? It doesn't have to be directly on course. You just got to be approximately in the right direction. All right, number 3. What is one tool, process, or hack in the last 3 to 6 months, either in your business or personal life, that you've employed to help save you time and or effort?
The ironic part about this question is that I don't think your viewers, but they probably have figured out that you're such a systems person. And for the last 2 years, almost every single system in my business, I got from Derek. So we could go with Slack, Asana, email hacking. But you know what? I will say one that I don't know if you gave me. I really like this Loom, just to record. So we do have a VA, and what we'll do is I'll do a quick 5-minute Loom video, send her the system, and you could actually tell her to actually create the systems herself after you send her the video. And super easy. Just why repeat doing something more than once if you don't have to? Something for you, Derek.
100%, man. Yeah. So I'm going back and forth about like cloud recording on Zoom with just screen share and everything. But Loom is definitely superior because of like the link sharing, the commenting on the video, and then you can tell whether or not someone's viewed the video. So definitely highly recommend for sure. And it's free. I think up to about 25 videos. And
you get 5 minutes of recording time.
Yep. 5 minutes. I've actually gotten to 7 on a few and they haven't taken it away. So it's pretty awesome.
I hope you're not listening to this podcast.
Number 4, if the people that you know had to describe you with one word, what do you think that word would be?
I would say honest. I think I'm honest to a fault, and I think I've grown my network because of that. I've given very honest feedback about my investments, and the most honest feedback that I've been on the ones that have not done well. And I think when you're honest about your bad moments, I think it opens the door for people to feel comfortable enough to share about theirs. And that's when you really learn stuff versus if you just constantly telling people how you're like the Michael Jordan here and you don't make any mistakes. And that's so annoying.
Yeah. And what I really love about that too, Dennis, is that you've always had very good feedback for me on webinars, on webinar recordings and everything. And I've always tried to implement that the best that I could with every one of them. And it's been very valuable. Another thing that comes out of these mistakes, right? When you try something. So really appreciate you for that. All right. Last question that we have, number 5, what is one small thing that most people just don't know about you?
One small thing that most people don't know about me. Let me take a strategic pause here.
It's very hard for people who are on podcasts a lot because a lot of their stories out there already, but it's all good.
I will say that one small thing is that I was actually in dancing school till I was like 14 years old. Actually helped me a lot in my other sports. But yeah, I got like 4 silver medals in one competition. And it was definitely an interesting experience.
Dude, that's incredible, man. I bet that comes in handy when you're trying to find a wife or a suitor. I wish I had that skill when I was 14. That's pretty awesome.
You know what? It's so different, like ballroom dancing to the stuff that, it's almost a completely different skill set. But it was fun. I definitely want to go with my wife to actually do a couple of classes and stuff. I feel like, now I'm like 20 years after drudging it out. I'll be like, oh, okay, this is nice to go leisurely whenever you want to.
I love that, man. Well, Dennis, dude, thank you so much for coming on the show. This has been an incredible value add for the listeners. But before you go, why don't you tell everyone how they can get in touch with you, how they can find out more about you and your world, maybe your book. Let us know how we can find out more.
Yeah, so the first place I would say, if you're interested in my book, The Alternative Investment Almanac, Expert Insights on Building Personal Wealth in Non-Traditional Ways. Sorry, I know that's a handful. You could actually find that on Amazon, and you could search for it with my name, Denis Shapiro, Dennis with one N. I actually have a special offer because it's been about a year since I published the book. So what I will do with, if anybody listens to this podcast and if they actually buy the book on Amazon, send me a copy of the review and I will pay for the book afterwards. So really excited about that offer. So that's the Alternative Investment Almanac, Expert Insights on Building Personal Wealth on Amazon. And then if you want to find out about me and my company, the best place is to go on SIH Capital Group.com. When you go in there, I actually have 2 abridged versions of my book. Click on Learn More, and I'll get those out to you. And I look forward to hearing from you.
That's awesome. Denis, man, thank you so much for all the value add that you're giving to our listeners with all of the great advice, then also your book offer as well with the review and the reimbursement on that. That's really, really cool. So please, you guys, go out there, take advantage of everything that Denis has got. He's got a lot of knowledge. I've been working with him for 2 years, over 2 years, 2.5 years on this mastermind. And I know that you'll be able to take great benefit from listening to him as well, just as I have. All right. That's
Derek,
all I got. Anything else, Denis?
Yeah, I forgot to actually where you're going to send the review. If you take a picture of the review and send it to me, send it to Denis, DENIS at SIHCapitalGroup.com.
There we go, man. All right. No excuses now, everyone. So please go out there and do that. And for all the listeners that have made it all the way to this point in the podcast, I really want to thank you guys. But please be sure, wherever you're listening or watching this podcast, please subscribe, like, comment, engage with us, because we want to hear from you. And we want to make sure that the people that we're bringing on are adding tons of value to you. We want to make sure this is effective for everyone involved. And so please, let's do that so that we can appease the algorithm gods as well and get more and more folks dialed into the podcast so that we can share this with more people. So we really appreciate you. Denis, thanks again, man, for coming on. It's been an awesome show. Really appreciate that.
Derek, thank you so much. It feels like a Monday now.
Oh, yeah, absolutely, man. Dear listener, thank you as well, and have a fantastic week. We'll see you next time. This is Derek. I'm signing off.